First of all, I was just so impressed with that collection of those interviews. My gosh, that's just great. I think Mark's done a really good job. Let's give him a nice round of applause. And just think how important that is to have that on record. I mean, for years I've been talking to people in Flint Hills and writing stuff down, but having them, seeing them do the actual talking is so much better than just having that tape, the audio tape. I think that's really, really important, and it's going to be a great record for the future. I want to ask the panel, what you saw up there, not counting yourself, what did you like best of what you saw up there? Paul, what did you...
I enjoyed that first one. Two old ladies talking about... I can appreciate the butchering of chickens and
the washing, butchering chickens.
Yeah.
The one that said Monday's still wash day.
right.
Yeah, it's the men that talk all the time, and the women are a little more reticent. And every time I'd go to somebody, arrange to talk to a woman, she'd say, "Well, why do you want to talk to me? You ought to talk to my husband. He's the one that was out and around." And I'd say to her, "Well, how did you used to wash clothes? And how do you wash clothes now?" "Well, now I just throw it in the machine and throw it in the dryer. But back then, Monday was wash day, Tuesday was ironing day, Sunday they baked bread for the whole week." I said, you'd think that was just ordinary life, but 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people aren't going to know that. That's going to be really, the ordinary daily life is going to be so interesting to those future generations. Tom, what impressed you most?
Well, I guess I enjoyed, I guess I learned a lesson maybe from Paul about driving those cows to the pond to wash their bags off.
Yeah, I'd never thought of that either.
I'd never thought of that and never heard of it before. So I learned a lesson there.
Well, I'd have to say Paul Seeley was my favorite part on there. He was my boss for 20 years.
Still kissing up to the boss. Piper?
I was just fascinated by how things used to be, and I think I take for granted that I can hop on a four-wheeler and go check cows, and I'm home within an hour. And we just shipped cows, and we, half of us are in trucks and four-wheelers, and there's a couple guys on horses, but just put them on a truck, and that's it. We're not riding to town all day or coming back.
And wasn't it nice to see someone of her generation on there? Yeah, now that I've become an old-timer myself, that's one thing, but and you need to get those stories from the old-timers, but it's sure nice to see somebody of the younger generation taking an interest, going to keep this Flint Hills folk life going on in the future. Denny?
It's got to be Jackie, and that's because my mother and Jackie went to school together, and we grew up by Walt and Jackie, and then her sister Jerry married Tom. They're brothers, and it was so great when I went to the website and saw her thing there, and it just reminded me of all the things we did together as families that you just don't see today like we used to, where we spent so much time, and I guess that's all we had to do.
Yeah. And it's really nice to have, Danny and Piper up here, because they represent, as far as I know, the oldest family ranch in the Flint Hills, still owned by the same family, 1856, I think it was, wasn't it?
1856.
Yeah, and that is really something to have. I mean, down in Texas, some of those ranches go back to, Mexican War and before the Mexican Revolution, actually, 1821. But in Kansas, came along quite a bit later in that state. It's rare that you have a family still owning land, still operating land that was settled before statehood even. So that's really nice to have that. Yeah. I was interested in, Paul's stories about Merle Teeter. We had Teeter friends and relatives, and I have to share a story that occurred. I think it was Jim Teeter, not Merle, that brought in cattle. This is in 1938, I believe it was, from east in Greenwood County in the Cassidy Stockyards. And just before they got into the yards, they got across the railroad track, but a big old Bramer steer with big horns got away from them and jumped the fence into the pasture, Oliver pasture, just north of the yards, and they couldn't get him in. And my dad and my uncle were hanging around. They were pretty young at the time, or young enough, I guess, at the time. And Jim Teeter says, "Can you guys get that steer?" And Uncle Marshall says, "Hell yes, we can." They figured they could do anything. And they had somebody call my grandfather to go. They had wasn't really a pickup, it was an old Model T that they'd cut the back off of and made kind of a little platform on and sent him up. Time they got sight of the steer, he was actually in Chase County, 3 miles north of Stockyards. And Uncle Marshall told Dad, says, kind of hold up here. I'm going to circle around this kind of canyon draw thing, and then you push him out, and I'll rope him when he comes up. And he did. And Dad got him healed, and they tied him. And my grandfather got there about that time, and then they loaded him on the back of that old Model T thing, homemade pickup. But they were about, 100, 150 yards from a ditch they could back that thing into. So they just had a rope around his horns. They just dragged that steer across the pasture. And you can see on his shoulder where they've worn that hair off, and then hauled him into the yards. And the rope on his horns they tied to someone says, "How are you going to get him off of there? How are you going to get him loose?" I said, "That's no problem." They tied the rope that was on his horns to a post there in the stockyards and drove out from under him. And when he bounced and hit the floor, he knocked the wind out, and they got the ropes off his legs and off his horns. And my mother took a photograph, and that steer's standing there. Man, he's looking mad as anything. And somebody's crawled up on the fence, and there's ropes here and ropes here on the ground. And Jim Teeter comes up and says, "What are you doing? You're hurting my steer. What are you doing to my steer?" And Uncle Marshall says, "What are you complaining about? Your cowboys couldn't even get him in the stockyards." So that's my Teeter story. Yeah.
When Wayne Bailey was talking about trailing cattle, one of the worst wrecks I ever saw was we were trailing cows and calves home down a lane, and when you're on drag, you're at the very back end, and the cattle get spread out, and you're pushing, and these happen to be cows and calves, and my brother-in-law David was he was always pretty much wasn't going to do anything to get something to go, and decided that he'd start roping these calves. He'd heel them, and he'd throw the rope down, and he'd heel a calf, and then he'd let him loose, and he'd heel another one. He let him loose, and about the third or fourth throw, he heeled the cow, and and she took off through the middle of the cows, and then she decided to go left into another pasture, and then the ones all behind her just decided to follow her. And so a job that should have taken us maybe an hour and a half, we spent all day going back there, and not a one of the cowboys ever said a word to him, because we'd all done something like that, and it just backfired. So
Yeah. I assume that heel rope was on one heel and not on both, so yeah.
one way.
Yeah.
You had to account for the cattle, guarantee your count, and it was Porter and Winter's cattle. Anyway, you if you couldn't have the cattle, you had to have the brand. So the first year come out in good shape. I think there was only 4 or 5 that died and had all the brands. Wayne was, I was working for Wayne Rogler. He was really happy on the pastures. The second year, boy, that West Farrington, we called it, so that'd be the West Farrington. There'd been 4 sections. They started dying. Every time you'd go out there, like one week I'd try to ride fences, and the next week I'd ride the cattle and check cattle. I got to where I have to ride cattle, look at cattle every week, because you'd find dead cattle. And finally called the veterinary, and he said they had blackleg. So I forget now, I think finally they didn't want to run them in and vaccinate. Said what died, but we had to find those things and cut those brands off. And man, boy, they're in July and August, you know, they got pretty ripe.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, you get those brands and hang them up on a clothes hanger. And I forget, I think there was about 28 or 29, something like that. And got ready to settle up that year. Went into Cassidy and eat lunch at a little old restaurant. It wasn't very big at that time, if you remember, Jim. I can't remember.
Opal's Cafe, and it was small, yeah.
That was Opal's, okay. Anyway, Wayne said, he was ready to settle up. He said, run out there and get the brands so he can count those. And that, I forget now what it was, Mr. Winters or Mr. Porter. He said, well, hell, I don't want to see those brands. If they died, they died. I'll take your word for it. I thought, my Lord, cut those brands off those stinking things, and he didn't care whether he'd seen them or not.
So you got pretty dirty and stinky for no good reason, I guess, cutting those brands off the dead ones, yeah.
But anyway, that was my story.
Yeah.
Employee of my aunt and uncle during the summertime. I spent with them from the time I was 5 years old till I was about 15, probably 15. And I grew up on out there in the summer in Oklahoma, and wheat farm and all the other good things. My uncle had a couple of horses, and I got to ride them and appreciated them very much. And so I'd work for him all summer, plowing, running a tractor on a combine, scooping wheat and all that. And he finally teamed up with a neighbor, and they were going to take a combine north to cut wheat for other people. And my father at that time had bought a little ranch in 75 miles west out at Lookout, Oklahoma, and had a house on it. And so that was a promise to me that I could not spend time working for an uncle. I had to go out there and live in that house in the summertime. Well, I talked my uncle into selling me one of his horses, and he was busy going north with that combine. He said, well, I don't have time to take you home. Why don't you just, I'll loan you my saddle and you just ride that pony home. And, okay. And 75 miles straight west. So I saddled him up about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and had to ford the Medicine River down there. And it's kind of tricky, a little quicksand in it. And I got across the river and headed on west and got way over there south of Hartner, Kansas, and stopped and begged supper out of real nice people there. had a little money to buy some oats for my pony, and so I had supper and fed my horse and got back on him, and he told me how to get across Salt Fork River. I had to go across the bridge. That was the safest way. And it was at night, and so I found my way to the bridge and headed on west. Got tired, real tired, and decided I'd lay down and sleep. So pulled the saddle off, laid down on the blankets, tied a rope around my wrist and around the pony, and so he wouldn't run off. And all he did was stand on top of me and whinny. Yeah, I couldn't sleep there. So I gave up on that, saddled him back up, and just headed on west. And about 3:30 the next day, I got to the house, and it was quite a tour for me for a 15-year-old kid. But when I got home, why, my parents had come out and they were anticipating me getting there, so they were there, and it's an old 3-room house, and they had a cot out on the porch, and boy, I was tired and hungry, and so I laid down on the couch, and I was there about a half hour, and my dad come in. He said, "We got cattle out, and you need to get your pony and let's go help me get these cattle in." So I got up and we saddled him up again, and away we went. I think I don't know. It was a good experience for a kid, but one I'll never forget.
You know, back in the trail drive days, that would have been pretty typical. Lots of times they didn't get to sleep much at all if the cattle were running or restless, and the trail boss would tell the complaining cowhands, "You can sleep in the winter." And one guy told him, "When this drive is over, I'm going to move to Greenland. The nights are 6 months long."
I remember when I started to school, we rode horseback to country school. I went all 8 years to country school, and we'd had a Shetland pony, and Dad would get us saddled up, and me and my brother would ride double on it, and just soon we'd get on that Shetland pony would take off and run just as hard as it could go. It was just about 2 miles home to the country school, and at that time, all the country schools had a horse barn. All the older people would remember that. And in the same way in the evening, we'd have hay there for the horse to eat. And we'd get back on the evening, it was the same way. That horse would just as soon as we got on, he'd take off and run as hard as he could until we got home and run in the barn.
Yeah, that's the Shetland ponies. They're
That was
kind
a
of
Shetland
ornery.
pony, yeah.
Westward we go toward the last buffalo, to the high plains of sturdy short grass, where the great southern herd still a sight beyond words, as it covers the prairie so vast. On the Plum Creek